Okay, letting people in now.
Great, thank you. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar with Richard Fletcher. My name is Eduardo Suarez. I am the head of comms at the Reuters Institute, and I will be the chair of the event. As you probably know, our speaker today will be Richard Fletcher. Richard is the senior research fellow at the Reuters Institute, and he's also the leader of our research team, and also the co-author of a few pieces of research that we have recently published on COVID-19. So we are really lucky today, and I'm sure that there will be many insights that you will get from this webinar. First of all, here are the rules of the webinar. After I make this brief introduction, Richard will show his presentation for around 20 minutes, 30 minutes. We will mute every microphone and hide every camera, so everyone can actually follow the presentation. And at any point, you can always send your questions through the chat function that you can actually find on your screen at the bottom of your screen. So just feel free to send questions through the chat, and I will raise the questions with Richard after the presentation is over. The webinar should finish around 2:15, so in 45 minutes or so. So plenty of time to talk about polarization and the pandemic, which is, I think, a present topic in the UK, but also in many other countries, including mine, Spain. So without further ado, Richard, the virtual floor is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'll just share my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for that introduction. As Eduardo says, I'm going to talk about polarized attitudes towards coronavirus news coverage. I will focus on the UK, but I will try to also touch on some of the research that we've done in a handful of other countries. And also, whilst the focus will be on polarization, I'm also going to try and talk about some of the areas where attitudes towards news coverage are not polarized and there's something approaching consensus. Now, if we just think back a few short months, the end of January 2020, we can remember this is when Britain left the EU, and there was a lot of talk at the time, not least from the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, about how the UK could heal some of the divisions that had been exacerbated or caused by Brexit. And of course, this was something as well that was on the minds of a lot of commentators, journalists, and also academic scholars. And once it became clear that the coronavirus was a pandemic, or at least was announced as such by the WHO, I think there was a brief moment where there was a belief that under the sort of terrible circumstances and all the problems that it would cause, there would perhaps be a sort of forgetting of partisan differences in some cases, and a sort of coming together within many countries that might in some way address some of the divisions that had arisen in politics in previous years. And we saw in some countries what has been called a rally round the flag effect, and this is where sort of support or approval for leaders started to rise from the middle of March, roughly. And also, particularly in the UK, there was sort of quite broad support for some of the UK's measures, some of the packages announced by the Chancellor. The lockdown had very strong approval across the board. And I think, as I said, there was a brief moment where it could be could be possible that there could be some kind of effect from coronavirus that sort of addressed polarization, but at the same time, it quickly became clear that many of the issues were deeply political. And this might, or at the same time, exacerbate some of the partisan differences that already existed in society. And of course, all this leads on to onto news coverage, because we know that news coverage and people's opinion of it is deeply tied to their political beliefs. So what kind of effect would this have on how people interpret coronavirus news coverage? And of course, this is very important because we know that the news media or news organizations are one of the primary sources of information about coronavirus. This data is from a report called Navigating the Infodemic that we published around a month ago. And although many of the other sort of sources of coronavirus information are used by people, it's also clear that these often come via the news media. So the news media has an absolutely critical role in conveying information about coronavirus, and therefore what people think about it and their attitudes towards it, if they're shaped by politics, this can matter quite a lot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through some of our recent research in this area. As I said, most of it will be focused on the UK, but I will try and touch on other countries as well. I'll talk first about some of the sort of attitudes towards the UK government's response to coronavirus, and then later talk about some of their attitudes towards the news coverage. And in doing that, I'll try to highlight some areas where attitudes towards news coverage are politically polarized, and then later where attitudes are broadly similar. Most of this data will come from our COVID-19 News and Information project, which is essentially based around a fortnightly panel survey of the UK population conducted by YouGov. What we do is we survey the same group of people each fortnight over the course of the pandemic. And this allows us to not only sort of track information and attitudes over time, but also how, because we're speaking to the same individuals each time, we can much more clearly see how things are changing, and also eventually try to identify some of the causal mechanisms behind those changes. So far, we've completed 2 waves. The third wave has just come out of the field, and we're beginning to start to analyze that at the moment, and we'll publish some of the results from that wave next week. At the moment, the plan is to repeat this 10 times. And you can find more information about the project at this URL. It's funded by the Nuffield Foundation, but conducted by the Reuters Institute at the University of Oxford. Now, as I said, the focus is really on how people get news and information about coronavirus. We've already published 2 fact sheets, which you can get the website. These are really just a sort of headline kind of overview of some of the data. Later on, when given time, we'll conduct more in-depth longitudinal analysis of this data. But for the moment, we do have some preliminary findings, but these are preliminary, and I think it's important to stress that. And this is what I'll talk about today. So polarization, which is going to be the main sort of focus, I think it's just worth spending a few minutes clarifying what we mean by that. So firstly, polarization as a term, which is a very commonly used term in social science, can be used to describe both processes and statuses. So it can be used to describe something that is changing over time, whether things are becoming more or less polarized, but it also can refer to a sort of a particular point in time. And that's what we're going to focus on now. Of course, polarization can be along different dimensions, left wing versus right wing, Leave versus Remain, which of course is slightly different, and so on. There are different ways of identifying groups which you want to analyze. It could be by how they vote, it could be by where they place themselves on a scale, or it could be by measuring attitudes towards different policies and then trying to form groups on that basis. And of course, once you've done that, there are different ways of measuring polarization and saying, well, are attitudes in this area polarized or not? Here, because this is preliminary analysis, we'll keep things quite simple. So what I'll do in most of the slides is compare differences between those people in our sample who identify themselves with the left and those that identify on the right. And I'll also try and contextualize that with data from the whole sample as well. It's important to point out we do have data on or other ways of measuring or identifying groups. So we ask people about their attitudes towards certain policies. We know how they voted, but for the time being, we're going to stick to the left-right self-placement. So first, let's look at some of the attitudes towards the UK government's response to coronavirus. One of the first things we did, conducted in the second week of April, was to ask people at that point whether they thought certain actors within society, such as the NHS, the government, news organisations and so on, whether they had done a good job in responding to coronavirus. And what we found was, perhaps unsurprisingly, very strong approval for the NHS, reasonably strong approval for the government. 54% said they thought it had done a good job so far in responding. News organisations, 37%. And most of the organisations or actors in this poll came out with a net positive approval rating. Now, we thought that this was interesting, but we also wondered whether this was this sort of overview was kind of papering over some differences of opinion within the population. And when we looked in more detail, we saw very big differences between those that identify with the left and those that identify with the right when it comes to whether they thought the government had done a good job in responding to coronavirus. So 82% of those on the right said they thought that the government was doing a good job, compared to just 14% on the left. So almost everyone on the right thought the government was doing a good job at that point, but only a very small number of those on the left. And it's interesting to sort of contrast that with opinions about the NHS or news organisations or tech companies, where opinion between left and right was broadly similar at that point. There's another way of approaching this question, and this is what we followed up with in our second survey to try and explore some of these differences in a bit more detail. We asked people whether they thought that the UK government's response has been better or worse than most other developed countries. On the whole, if we look at in the horizontal centre, we can see that across the whole sample, almost half, 46%, say that they thought the government response had been worse or much worse than most other countries, 36% about the same, and 12% better. But again, we can see quite big differences of opinion between those on the left and those on the right. So 75%, 3/4 of those on the left thought the government's response had been worse or much worse. And just 17% on the right said the same. But when it comes to whether people think the response has been better, just 4% on the left compared to 27% on the right. So again, we can see quite big differences of opinion between the left and the right. Of course, none of these are hugely surprising. We're asking people directly about their opinion of the government and how they've dealt with coronavirus. But we also see differences when we kind of step away from these kind of obvious sort of partisan issues. So if we ask people whether they think the UK government's current approach is too focused on protecting the economy, too focused on protecting people from the virus, or about the right balance, we don't see huge polarisation here, but we do see differences. So most people, looking at the whole sample, 55%, say that they think the balance was about right. But on the left, you can see that the people are much more likely to think that the focus has been too much on protecting the economy. And on the right, we can see a slight difference between those on the right and those on the left when it comes to thinking about how focused the government's response has been on protecting people from coronavirus. Again, these are, I wouldn't describe this as polarisation per se, but there's a clear difference of opinion on this matter between the left and the right. Slightly differently, whether they thought that how concerned they are about the government as a source of false or misleading information about coronavirus. 32% of the whole sample said they're either extremely or very concerned, but this rises to 51%, around half on the left, and just 22% say the same on the right. Again, perhaps not indicative of polarization as such, but clearly a difference of opinion or concern when it comes to the left and the right. I think it's important, again, to reiterate that this is not particularly surprising. I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, there was sort of a view, perhaps briefly, that some of the circumstances and the severity of the circumstances would cause people to perhaps temporarily sort of let go of sort of partisan opinions. But we are asking here directly about what people think of the government, and it's not surprising that the left-right differences matter. But we can also see, well, does this spill over into news coverage? One of the ways we sort of thought about this was to ask people how they think the media has treated the government and their response. And here we do see clear left-right differences. So we asked people whether they think the news media has either been too critical of the government, whether they think they've covered the government fairly, or not being critical enough of the government response. If we look at the central vertical column, we can see that across the whole sample, the opinion is divided fairly evenly three ways. So 28% think that the news media have covered the government fairly, 29% think it's been too critical, and 30% think that the media has not been critical enough. But if we look at left-right, again, we can see quite clear differences. So 66% of those on the right, 2/3 of those on the right, think that think that the media has been too critical of the government. And 6% think that it's not been critical enough. And that's almost completely mirrored when we look at those on the left. So 63% think that the news media has not been critical enough of the government, and just 5% think that the media has been too critical. Again, perhaps not hugely surprising, because we're asking a question that sort of relates directly to the government, but it is interesting how the media and their response has been sort of captured by some of the polarization that exists and people's views on the government. Another way of thinking about this, which I think is interesting, because here we weren't directly asking people about what they think of the government. In a way, it was quite separate. So we asked people whether they think the news media has exaggerated the coronavirus pandemic. Again, opinions sort of fairly evenly split. If we look at the central column, 44% of the whole sample, I should put it the other way around, 26% think that the news media has exaggerated the coronavirus pandemic, but this rises to 41% on the right and lowers to 15% on the left. So again, we can see differences between the left and the right in terms of whether they think the media has exaggerated coronavirus or not. And I think it's important to note we're not asking about anything to do with the government here. This is simply about the media's response. So we can see that polarization exists when we ask people about the government, when we ask people about the news media's coverage of the government, and also in some sort of dimensions about the media's coverage in general that maybe has nothing to do with the government. Now, I think this is the data we have which sort of points towards polarization, but I think it's important to make clear that not all aspects of the news media's coverage are seen as polarized, or at least we can't see any differences or very small differences between the left and the right. So here's an example. So we asked people whether they think the news media helped them understand the coronavirus pandemic. And you can see that 50% or higher across the whole sample say that they think the news media has helped them understand. So 59% agreed with this statement across the whole sample. This does drop slightly to 50% on the right and rises to 63% on the left. But on the whole, I think opinion here is quite consistent and around half at a minimum say that they think the news media has helped them understand the pandemic. Similarly, if we ask whether people think the news media has explained what they can do in response to the pandemic, then 66% of the whole sample agreed with that statement. It again rises very slightly on the left and falls slightly on the right, but on the whole, we can see that there are only really small differences between the left and the right when it comes to this aspect and what they think of this aspect of the news media's coverage. So it's clear that not everything is polarized in this way. So how can we sort of bring this together? And I think it's important to stress this is a preliminary interpretation, but I think one thing that sort of perhaps stands out is that we see generally positive views about the news media's ability to report facts about coronavirus. So when I say this, I mean sort of information about current events, and in particular, information about how people should respond, what they should do in the face of the pandemic. But we see polarized views when we ask people about people's opinions of the news media's interpretation of coronavirus, their opinion on coronavirus, what they think their readers should think about coronavirus, including things like tone, comparisons with other country, opinions, and crucially, their evaluation of the government's response. We do have some data from other countries on some of these issues. And in some ways, we see a similar picture to the UK. So on the whole, over half people agree that the news media in their country, so looking at the UK, US, Germany, Spain, South Korea, and Argentina, over 50% in most cases say that the news media has helped them understand the pandemic. And similarly, over half say that they think the news media has explained what they need to do in response to the pandemic. And a minority generally think that the news media has exaggerated the pandemic. So we see a similar overall picture within these countries, but we also see different polarization dynamics. Now I've explained what those dynamics are in the UK. In the US, it gets slightly different. So there are fewer areas which are not polarized in the US, which probably won't be a surprise to many people. So in a country like Germany, we see a similar pattern to the UK. Spain, there's less polarization along left-right divides, but of course that could just be because the left-right sort of categorization is not really capturing the right sort of groups within society, and polarization might be, exist elsewhere within society among different groups. And I think this is why we should be slightly cautious about sort of applying a sort of general principle to sort of news coverage in different countries. I think it'll take more analysis to sort of really uncover how polarization is playing out, if at all, in some of these other countries. I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions. Just as a reminder, the next fact sheet from the project will be published at the beginning of next week. And please look at the website if you want more information about any aspect of the project. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, for the presentation. There are a few questions now that our audience has done through the chat function. I encourage everyone with a question for Richard to just write it down on the chat while we are starting the Q&A now. I have a question first from myself, if it's possible. Especially in the infodemic report, there are data from countries with left-wing governments and right-wing governments. We even have data from Germany, which is a strange country in the sense that it has a great coalition government. So is there any difference that we appreciate between polarizations in countries with right-wing government and with countries with left-wing governments, like the Spain in this case?
And this is something,
by the way, yeah.
This is something that we want to look into in more detail. I think, we started with the UK because we have the most data there, and because the project is based in the UK, in a way, that's the country that we understand the best. I think it's very, we haven't done the analysis yet, but I think it's very likely that, given that the government is the central actor in the pandemic in most countries, of course the opposition parties play a role, but really a lot of attention is focused on the government, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why we saw a rally around the flag effect. I mean, it's unusual for the government to be on people's have a slot on television in the UK every single day for months on end. So the prominence really matters, and I think it's very likely that because people have sort of pre-existing political attitudes and those are applied to the government response in a sense, kind of regardless of what that response is, then I think it's very likely that it will reflect what people's opinion is of the government. So in a country with a left-wing government, I would expect sort of more criticism from the right than from the left, and in turn I expect this to sort of in some way trickle down to people's opinion of the news media, but to greater and lesser extent. So I think we know from other research that the US and the UK has one of the most polarized news media environments in the world. Polarization is much lower in a country like Germany. It still exists, but it's much smaller. So that I would expect then the effect of people's attitudes towards the government and the polarization associated with that, I think the effect would be less when it comes to evaluating the media. But this is an empirical question, and it's one we'd be interested in exploring further.
Thank you, Richard. We have some questions. The first one is from Nina Nikolic, and she's asking, are you seeing a concentrated effort of a specific interest group using COVID narrative and communication areas to push an agenda or policy that has really nothing to do with the pandemic, but piggybacks on it?
I mean, I can only really sort of speak about the UK, and I think that this is certainly one of the things that people were concerned about at the start of the pandemic. And I'm sure it exists in some form, but I don't think it would be fair to say that it's been particularly prominent, or at least sort of movements that are attempting to do that kind of thing. I don't really see much. I mean, this is quite anecdotal, I have to say, but I don't really see much of that in at least in news coverage. I think the focus has been very strongly on the Conservative Party and the government. This is changing slightly because Labour now has a new leader. They were leaderless effectively at the start of the pandemic, and they're becoming more prominent. But I haven't seen a huge amount of space for others to come into the conversation. Even some of the smaller parties in major political parties in the UK are not really part of the coverage at the moment, I don't think.
Yeah, makes sense. Patricia Sambrin, she asks if we have noticed any substantial shifts of opinion between the first wave of the UK COVID News and Information project and the second wave. And I think there are probably a few, right?
Well, I mean, we have only properly analysed data from 2 waves so far, and obviously we'd be quite cautious about sort of talking about trends with any sort of 2 data points. Mm-hmm. And we've started to look at the data from the 3rd wave, and there are differences. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I think there are possible early signs of what I would sort of call sort of coronavirus fatigue. Whereby people are paying less attention to the news than they were at the start. And also you do see some attitudes towards the government and the media perhaps starting to change. I wouldn't call them trends yet because we just need more data, but that is absolutely the aim of the project, is to try and track these. And I think one of the things that's unusual about this as a case study is just how quickly things can change. So I think that even though we do see possible evidence of some differences between now and when we started, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for that to sort of swing completely in the other direction. So trends are absolutely what we're looking at, but I would be a bit cautious about saying more than that at this stage.
Nina Nikolic again, she's asking, I mean, you mentioned the rally around the flag effect, and she's asking, do you see increasing perception of patriotism as diametrically opposed to critical thinking or questioning in media coverage and government messaging? I don't know if I understand the question correctly, but I think it's, yeah.
I mean, I think I see what the point is. I think the project, we really sort of, the focus of the project is really on news audiences and what they think. I think there's a sort of separate set of questions about how news media coverage has changed over the course of the pandemic, and I'm sure that there are teams of researchers who are looking at that question, and I think absolutely they'll be focusing on those kind of issues. I think that it certainly wouldn't surprise me if the results of a study like this did show, for example, sort of evidence of sort of patriotic rhetoric, let's say, being used sort of increasingly. And I think that the absolutely key sort of aspect of news coverage in coronavirus has been comparisons with other countries. Now, I think we should absolutely be sort of cautious about those comparisons, but it's undeniably been a part of the coverage, and you can easily see how that might connect to certain narratives. I don't know whether it sort of necessarily sort of has any effect on sort of critical thinking. I think that's more of a sort of psychological question. But I think that it's certainly sort of the role of the sort of nation and the comparison with other countries is crucial to how people understand coronavirus within the UK.
We have, it's not a question really, it's more like a research suggestions, I guess, from Peter Burke. He's saying, I would be very interested to know how much attitudes correlate with newspaper readership. There is a huge contract between readers of The Guardian and readers of the Daily Express, let's say. Is that something that you're looking into, or, at some point?
Definitely, yeah. And I think what we've seen so far, I didn't really touch on it in this presentation. What we've seen so far is that, I mean, from previous research, we've seen that sort of readership or use of particular news sources absolutely correlates with people's political beliefs, and it does so in quite sort of predictable ways. So people who are more left-leaning are more likely to read The Guardian, people who are more right-leaning are more likely to read The Sun, and so on. This is quite predictable. When it comes to sort of television sources like the BBC, they tend to have a much more sort of even split between different groups, something that might be sort of slightly changing over time, but this, broadly speaking, is correct. And when we look specifically at the use of sources for coronavirus coverage, then we, at the moment at least, we're tending to see the same kinds of patterns. One important caveat to this is that it's normally a mistake to think that just because these sort of preferences exist, that no people on the left, for example, use right-leaning sources and vice versa. That's not true. People tend to, particularly online, because it's very easy to sample news from lots of different sources, they tend to spread their news consumptions kind of thinly across multiple sources with different perspectives, but still maintaining a preference for sources that align with their view. I was going to add something else, but it's escaping me now. Yeah, I think that I can sort of point towards some of our sort of previous research, which has sort of looked at this. We did a study of the news coverage during the UK election called "A Mile Wide, an Inch Deep," and that contains some more data on sort of partisan sort of news selection patterns.
I will share the link to that report now on the chat function. There's another question from Ted Sullivan. He's asking, is there any polling allowance made in terms of asking people who have had personal experience of the pandemic, and whether there is polarization or more consensus reflected in the views of those people?
That's not something we've asked about in our survey. I mean, of course, it's an option. I think that it has to be, from a sort of research ethics point of view, it has to be approached a little bit carefully. But yes, I mean, I think it's a legitimate thing to ask about in a survey nonetheless. I think that one of the challenges with it would be, ensuring that you had a large enough group of people who have been sort of personally affected. I think if you ask people, you know, whether they've had coronavirus, for example, in using a survey of a couple of thousand people, you're going to have a very small number of people, I think, within that group who had, and then that would make it difficult to analyze. So you would have to sort of extend the sort of the definition, I think, quite broadly in order to be able to do meaningful analysis. But it's not something we've done, but I'm sure others are looking at that.
Yeah, especially with the immunity numbers that we are seeing in countries like Spain, for example. Yesterday we have figures, it's just 5% of the population, so it would be really difficult, I guess. A question from Fabrizio Giardina. Obviously he wants us to do the same for Italy. I think he says this same research would be very interesting for Italy. Do you have any data or plan to include Italian audiences and media in future research?
I mean, the Reuters Institute is you know, we try to do as much as we can in a range of different countries. One of our sort of key sort of aims is to make comparisons between countries when it comes to news use and attitudes towards the media. We've done one 6-country study area which didn't include Italy, but we don't have any sort of concrete plans to repeat that project in other countries just yet, but it's certainly something we're looking into.
We have a similar question from Edwin Talam. He wants to know if we are going to include any African countries in the future. I mean, obviously we are about to publish the digital news report that is not COVID focused, but includes at least a couple of African countries, right, Richard? That's
right. Yeah. So we do have a commitment to including more countries, or studying more countries that are considered to be part of the global south, and we've just started to conduct research in some countries in Africa. So in the 2020 digital news report, which we'll publish in June, we'll be able to bring some data from Kenya and South Africa.
That's great. There's a question from Siansam Na, I hope I pronounced it correctly, and he or she is asking about results and data from South Korea, which we are lucky to have, right, from the infodemic report. There are some insights. I don't know if, I don't know if there's at least a couple of things that you can share with this questionnaire.
Yes, it was. South Korea was part of that project, and my suggestion would be to we can send a link if it's useful to a translated version of that report, which was published within Korea by the Korean Press Foundation, and I think that they've also sort of looked at the data themselves, and I think sort of offering their own interpretation. So that would be we can find a link to that.
Yeah, I just shared that link in the chat. Another question from Nina Nikolic that she has made a few. She's asking what would be, I think that it would be interesting, she says, to see as a follow-up if there are any differences of attitudes within the UK as related to the 4 nations media coverage. I think she's asking basically about Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales. I don't know if that's something that you've considered.
Yes, and I think it looks like something that will become more important, because I think at the start of the pandemic, or let's say when lockdown started, there was obviously a sort of consistent policy across all of the nations within the UK, and we can now see that's starting to change. So England is taking a different approach to Scotland, for example, and of course Scotland has its own sort of public health authorities, it has its own government, and they will have some sort of flexibility to make different decisions or depart from England's policy or UK policy as a whole. And I think that will certainly affect people's evaluation of the government response, and also create the potential for that to filter down through into media coverage, because we know that media coverage from the same outlets can differ slightly within countries within the UK. So I think that's definitely a possibility, and I think it's something that's going to become more important.
A final question from me. I mean, as the coverage of the pandemic and the policy decisions of the pandemic turn from health decision to the economy mostly. Do you expect more polarization? I mean, you touched a little bit on this during your presentation, but do you think that's something that we are going to see, that things start more political or more polarized as we turn into the economy as the main topic?
I mean, this is one of the sort of key questions that we hope to answer in the project. I mean, if I was sort of forced to make a prediction, I would say that does seem likely. I think as the dealing with the pandemic starts to involve more and more questions about the economy, for example, as opposed to questions about sort of health and epidemiology, then I think there's more scope for those kind of issues to be sort of politicized or to be for there to be a sort of legitimate political take on what the right option is, which is not always there when it comes to questions about health. And it seems almost inevitable that we're going to move towards that as decisions about how to sort of relax the lockdown and sort of restart the economy become more pressing.
Yeah, I think we're starting to feel that kind of scenario here in Spain. So it really makes sense also in other countries. Well, thank you so much, Richard, for the presentation and for the webinar. Also, thank you everyone for joining us. Finally, I would like to say three things, as I always do. First, we really appreciate your time, especially the journalists who have joined, because it's a busy time for everyone now. And we appreciate your service when covering this global pandemic. Second, we will send the slides of the presentation and also the video of this webinar by email in the next few hours, so you will have that too. And finally, we would like to remind you that we have a webinar tomorrow at 3 p.m. UK time with Jay Rosen, the journalism professor from New York University. So we hope that you can join us. We will share the link on our social channels, and also you have it on our own website. Thank you everyone for coming. Please wash your hands and stay safe and stay sane during this difficult time. And we hope that you can join us for webinars in the future. Thank you.